Welcome to the latest episode of the Mind-Gut Conversation podcast, a place to learn about new ideas from thought leaders in the area of optimal health and the science of mind-gut microbiome interactions. Today, I have the great pleasure to speak to Dr. Barney Schlinger, a passionate naturalist, amazing scientist, and author of the recently published fascinating book, The Wingsnapppers: Lessons from an Exuberant Tropical Bird. Dr. Schlinger is a professor in the departments of Integrative Biology and Physiology and in the departments of Ecology, Evolution, and Behavior, and holds several prestigious positions at UCLA, including Associate Dean of Life Science and co-director of the Laboratory of Neuroendocrinology at the Brain Research Institute. He has been funded by the National Institutes of Health and the National Science Foundation for over 30 years and is the author of nearly 190 peer-reviewed scientific articles in high-impact journals. I should mention that both of us have been UCLA faculty members for several decades, as well as neighbors in the beautiful Topanga Canyon. Welcome to the show, Barney. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be able to pick your brain for about 60 minutes about a topic that people would think are not of direct relevance to my interests of brain-gut interactions, but as people will see during the course of this conversation, there's actually quite a few very intriguing connections between the songbirds on the one side and the brain-gut connection. In fact, so you published a fascinating book entitled "The Wingsnapppers: Lessons from an Exuberant Tropical Bird," and here's the book.
And that's the bird.
And that's the bird, so everybody knows what we're talking about. And I mean, this book is fascinating. Certainly for scientists, a collection of all the relevant facts about this bird in the field. But there's also areas in it, I think, for a non-scientist that people find very interesting, particularly those who love birds or bird watchers or
Right.
So let me start out with this. What got you interested in writing this book?
Well, really, the main reason is, I mean, I've been studying this bird for almost 30 years now, and it's an extraordinary creature. So I thought it deserved a story. But the main reason is, as a biologist, I'm very aware that we often compartmentalize biology. Someone is a neuroscientist or an endocrinologist or a field biologist and even in education, when you take courses in biology, you take a course in molecular biology, we compartmentalize it. And yet, in fact, if you piece all that together, you create an organism, and the organism is really kind of an indescribable output that none of the individual compartmentalized parts can really form. And I wanted to try to tell the story of this bird by including all of the different areas of biology that piece together to make the bird. So it goes from molecular biology all the way up to, laying in the mud in the field and watching the birds, perform. And I tried to write it again for people who just like nature or like birds. So there's a little bit of science that's a little, maybe a little bit tough, but I've tried to make it accessible and such.
So, what you just said, I mean, I've interviewed, you may have listened to some of the previous podcasts, a couple of recent ones, this evolving concept of like systems biology, that we don't look at just one small dimension in a reductionistic way, but we put the whole thing together. So what you just said reminded me of that general concept.
Yes, but when you look at typical systems biology, they might be using all of these different areas that come together to, again, speak about maybe one network that is involved with the gut or with the brain, but it's still not really the whole organism in many ways. So yeah, I think that's a good way to think about biology.
So there's several aspects that when we talked about this, and I should mention, so Barney and I, we are neighbors in a beautiful natural setting just outside of Los Angeles with lots of birds. So and we've talked about some of these concepts that we're going to go through today before. So let's start with the star of that book, the male mannequin bird, who displays an extraordinary courtship behavior, which is almost unparalleled in the animal kingdom. You also say that, you know, that you can think about the mannequins as professional acrobats, not just you know, people that have this amazing courtship behavior. So let's talk about this, both the courtship behavior, and you may just in a few sentences describe what this is for people who have not seen it in documentaries.
Yeah.
Like Attenborough's, you know, a documentary, like one of his shows this in an amazing fashion. But you may want to just describe this. What's so unique about this courtship behavior?
Well, first of all, the male birds, they gather in these groups in the forest. They're called leks, and there can be anywhere from 3 to 5 males to, in some cases, maybe 30 males. And they're separated from one another by maybe 5 meters or 10 meters. And each male clears a little patch of forest, which is bare dirt. And the birds only weigh about 18 grams. It's a small bird. So it may seem maybe not a big deal to you that they clear a little patch, but you have to realize you're in the middle of rainforest and there's lots of stuff falling and leaves, and so it's quite a remarkable little trait. But the courts that they clear are always surrounded by 3 or more little saplings. And what the male does is he does a dance or a routine where he jumps from perch to perch, and landing impeccably. And each time he jumps, he doesn't fly. And in the middle of each flight, he throws his wings over his back and makes this very loud snapping sound. It's as loud as what I'm doing, you know, but I weigh 180 pounds and he weighs 18 grams. And sometimes what they do is they do a half flip with a half twist down to the ground, and then they spring up onto a branch, and then they continue this whole process. And what's quite remarkable is that if you're there watching this bird in the field, it just looks like this frenetic bit of activity. But if you videotape it with very high-speed video, we've used up to 1,000 frames per second high-speed video that we slow down, and you see that the male is just performing this beautiful acrobatic routine. It's like a floor exercise that you would see a human athlete do. When he jumps from perch to perch, he has a elongated feathers under his chin, and he holds it out. So he's showing it like a flag to the female who's watching, usually. And so he looks like he was shot out of a cannon, you know, when he flies across, but it's all done very, very fast. And so it's quite remarkable. It's loud and it's visual, and and because you have a group of males around, when one male it starts doing his routine, typically when a female shows up, all the other males will start doing it as well. So this whole patch of forest just explodes in sound. It's quite remarkable.
Is this an innate behavior, or do these males have to learn this over time to become these acrobats?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it's both. I think that we see, so in the first 2 years of life, the male, as you saw in that when you showed the book, the male is this brilliant red and black, yellow and black color. The juvenile males look like females, and they're just completely dull olive green. They disappear in the forest very, very easily. So these males only acquire that adult plumage in their second full year of life. And we've seen these green birds, which we assume are these males, they fly in and they will actually watch the male doing it, his behavior, and then they'll fly out away from this gathering, and you'll see them kind of like practicing. And it's usually got little very soft snaps, and you see them kind of jumping slowly. But so we think that they know how to do it, but it's when their testosterone levels really rise in their second year of life that they suddenly start doing it well. But and you may ask me about this a little later, but we do think that the females are watching this and selecting males based on the quality of their performance and the speed, how swiftly they're doing these jumps. And I think it takes them many years to get better and better and better and better until they are performing well enough for a female to choose them. We know they're very long-lived birds. These are, 18 grams is a small bird, and we know that they can be on their little territory or their arena for 10 years in a row, if not more.
Do they stay at the same arena?
They do. Many of them do. Some of them do probably move around, but we know some do. Yeah.
Yeah, you were saying this about that, the whole thing, they do the whole thing to attract females, obviously. Right. And the females are looking for the most attractive and most talented male. So since said, they do this over years. So if they're not selected, this is a lot of work to get selected for a mate. If they don't get selected one time, they try again. So they keep trying every year.
And their breeding season it's a very long season. They start in the area where we're at in the country of Panama. They start in about mid-January, and they are at their arena every day, displaying in the morning and in the afternoon. They take a break in midday when it's really hot and humid. But they're there every day until June or July, performing these behaviors. And if they're unsuccessful, they are back again the next year in January and doing it for 6 months or more.
That's amazing. And like one side effect of all this is that the best and most attractive males are being selected for procreation. So it's an evolutionary mechanism to select, not just the most beautiful, but also the most talented, I would say.
Yes, that's right. So there's, we really think that females are able to choose males based on their neuromuscular competence. And that's what this particular routine allows the males to show off. They may also be choosing males that are older. If you can, if you're a male in the forest where there's a lot of predators and, rain and wind, and if you can survive for 10 years, then you're probably have good genes. And so if your performance gets better and better and better every year, then the ones that are performing the best routines are old and desirable to females.
So the big question is, how come they have all this time? They don't seem to have much else to do, the males, than doing this courtship behavior. Why just a few birds in the world, like the birds of paradise and in New Guinea, and these birds, why do they have the time to do this? And then
yeah, well, it's this is where we can start talking about the gut, because what we know is that these birds are frugivores. They eat fruit, and the forest is filled with trees and shrubs, all sorts of flora that make berries. And so there is an abundance of food for these birds. And that abundance of food, one thing it does is it liberates the females. She doesn't need the male's help in raising the babies. In fact, she may not want a male nearby because there's a lot of nest predators in tropical forests. I mean, everything wants to find nests and eggs, monkeys, toucans, I mean, everything, snakes. So they want to be secretive and they may not want the males around. So so the females will choose a mate, let him copulate, they fly off and they build the nest, lay the eggs, incubate, raise the babies all by themselves. So the males have nothing to do with that, which liberates them to try to attract more females, and thus they can, just elaborate these various plumage characteristics and behaviors and such to attract females.
So it's really amazing that the availability of fruit, basically of berries, enabled this dramatic change in behavior that most other birds don't have.
Yeah, and we one of the more recent bodies of work that we've done together with a consortium of other scientists that are interested in these birds is we've sequenced the genomes of a number of different species, and as well as some related species. And we know that a few million years ago, this group of mannequins separated from a group of birds that are basically like our flycatchers that many people may know, they're very plain colored. They have very simple little vocalizations, and they just, they fly out, dash out and catch insects. So they're insectivores. And some of them in the tropics also eat some berries, but the mannequins seem to have evolved several different features that enabled them to really take and eat fruits. So they evolved a sweet receptor. So many people don't know, but a lot of birds don't have a taste for sweet. Hummingbirds for sure, but they evolved it as a group. And so did the mannequins. Plus, they evolved some other metabolic traits, enzymes that enable them to better utilize fructose and some other features of being able to digest these berries. So that all happened. And once those started to evolve, then the birds could then start feeding on fruits, and then the whole social system and sets of behaviors started to diverge and evolve separately from these flycatchers.
I mean, listening to this, I can't help, to sort of connect or have a thought to my own area of scientific interest. So in these berries, polyphenols are sort of the main ingredients, and there's a lot of interest. I mean, they usually given the wrong name of antioxidants, which they do in the test tube, but not in the intestine of animals. And so I just wonder, what role the microbiome plays in all of.
Well, I think it's a fantastic question, because I'm quite sure that there are microbiome specializations that enable them to utilize these fruits. And I mean, one thing, when you think about birds, think about migratory birds who maybe they spend half their years living in the rainforest, in the tropics, and then they fly to Canada and they breed. In the breeding season, they're totally feeding on insects, and so their entire gastrointestinal system is designed for that. But when they're down in the tropics where there's fruit, some of them are eating now a good bit of fruit or insects and fruit and such. So there are undoubtedly gastrointestinal changes that are occurring seasonally that enable them to better utilize the resources in these two different places. And some of those we know are sort of physiological, but I just, there's no doubt that the microbiome is changing and helping them, and it's just an area that has received little study, and it's
Yeah,
ripe for
yeah,
study.
yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, the main connection that I make is, so the main part of this berry diet, these polyphenols are these large molecules that can't really be absorbed intact in the small intestine. So they require the microbiome to break them into smaller molecules. And depending on what kind of set of microbial ecosystem you have, you're either a good an expert in breaking down these polyphenols, or you're not. So depending
Yeah.
on, so there's a lot of seems to be an area that like a very exciting area for scientists, but also with relevance for humans and
Well,
diet.
and one other little piece to this is, of course, the fruits have a lot of pigment, so there can be carotenoids, or there can be other precursors that eventually get distributed or deposited in the feathers of the birds to give them their bright colors. And so the microbiome may participate in making some of those. I mean, they could be polyphenols, or there can be other molecules that require some modification to be absorbed and then utilized to create beautiful plumages.
Yeah, fascinating story. So I mean, one thing, like before you told me that, so males can try this over and over again, even in one season, and then over several years. So initially, I thought when you watch a movie of this courtship behavior, you feel sorry for the males that are not being selected in typical human way. You think, are they getting
Yeah.
depressed, or are they basically dying off because they're so depressed because they're not chosen? But that's doesn't seem to be the case. So they
I think it makes them try harder.
there was also something, I think you mentioned this earlier, this flapping with the wings, and I
Yeah.
found that also intriguing, that the neurons, or the networks of neurons, and maybe even the muscles that are responsible for this wing flapping are in some ways related to the neurons that regulate our like vocal expressions.
Yeah, I mean, I'm speculating here because I don't know the actual answer to that, but um, uh, we know that um, the neurons that innervate the muscles that control vocalizations, they're located in the basal hindbrain or the dorsal spinal cord. And they're right next to, I mean, and this is developmentally, they're right next to the neurons that will ultimately innervate the forearms. And this is true in fish, in birds, and it has a lengthy history. Um, and we know that um, language, we think of language as purely a vocal process. But of course, as you're watching me now, I'm talking with my hands as well as talking with my voice. Or sign language, or drumming, which is a communication kind of signal. These are all forearm-based forms of communication. And so it may very well be that in the mannequins, there is a relationship between those neurons that are telling their wings to make this wing snap, which is this loud snap. I also didn't mention, but um, the muscles that control the wings in these birds, there's a specialized muscle in the back. Most birds, you may know, if you eat chicken or turkey, you know that the back is really flat. There's almost no back musculature because the muscles that are involved in flight are all on the ventral surface. There's the muscle that lifts the wing is on the ventral surface, and it has a tendon that goes over like a pulley system that lifts the wing. Very much unlike us. But there's a muscle on the back of the bird, the mannequin, that is enlarged, and it's specialized for this very powerful and very rapid snap. And it's one of the fastest peripheral muscles of any species that's ever been studied. And by fast, I mean the contraction is extremely fast. So they can do this and throw their wings together about the same speed as a hummingbird flies with its wings. But it's hitting its wings together, its wrists, and it's that hitting of the wrists together that make the snap. But they can do it so fast that it sounds like, and so this is all part of this use of their wings to communicate an auditory signal. And you might ask, why is an auditory signal so important? Well, in the rainforest, which is dense and thick, a visual signal doesn't go very far. You have to be very close to the animal to see the visual signal. But the acoustic signal, this loud snapping, especially if you have a whole group of males in the forest doing it, it can travel for hundreds and hundreds of meters through the forest. So females that are out feeding, 300 meters away, they're going to hear it, and that's going to attract them in to find these males. One of the things about this I mentioned earlier is that it's androgens that are responsible for stimulating the males to perform these behaviors. And we know that it's fundamentally androgens acting on muscle, because you can treat the birds with a drug that will block peripheral androgen receptors, but not androgen receptors in the brain. And if you do that, you limit both the gross parts of the performance, but also the fine motor components of it. So it's a real muscular feature. But the other piece of it is, like I was mentioning, that they clear this arena in the forest. Females could care less about clearing arenas in the forest. We've had birds in aviaries that are built in the middle of the rainforest. And if you take males and females and put them in there, the males will clear a little court. And then you can just put leaves in the court, and males will immediately remove them. Females will never do that. You can give the females testosterone, they will never clear a court. If you give males testosterone, they are crazy about keeping their court clean. So this, you think about, there's a real cognitive and a visual system here of keeping a court clear, which is hormone dependent, and it's sex specific. And it's a rather complex, interesting behavior.
Yeah, no, this is really, yeah. So I mean, the one question I want to ask, which is really more speculation, if we try to extrapolate this to human courtship behavior, obviously it depends on cultures. In different cultures, there's some very elaborate forms of courtship. In others, now we've kind of reduced it to courtship on the internet to the minimalist amount. What are your thoughts about how to which human behaviors does this in any way correlate?
Yeah, it's a great question. One of my colleagues put together a little presentation where she basically drew upon the Saturday Night Live, movie with, John Travolta out on the dance floor, and he was the alpha male, and the females were judging him, and they're standing all around, and he had a court out on the stage, and so you can look at it in kind of the humorous way, but undoubtedly we as humans pay attention to each other in both our appearance and our whether it's our intellectual qualities or our physical qualities and such. So we're not really all that different. We just use words to describe it. But I do think that this athleticism is certainly something, athleticism in humans is a huge piece of our culture and our enjoyment and our assessment of others. And it certainly crosses boundaries. It's not restricted to just males. it's males and females. And so how that plays a part in evolution and reproduction, I don't know, but certainly hormones act on muscles in males and females just like they do in the birds, and we assess it.
I mean, the
just
whole
like the female bird.
the whole gym culture is a good example, you know.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, interesting in humans, it seems to be regional. You know, not everybody in the world is going to the gym, but in certain regions of the world or the US, this has become sort of a main part of courtship. Even to get to know each other in the gym, you know, for young people it's a little bit, you know, comparable to what you described for these birds.
Yeah, but you know, think about. I mean, again, this may sound a little ridiculous, but sports, I mean, it's worldwide. I mean, soccer, having a group of boys or girls out on a court or an arena, performing and playing, and each of them competing with each other, and we watch and we cheer, but it's an assessment process, and it seems to have a lengthy history in human culture, and it is widespread throughout the world.
Yeah, that's an excellent example. And so, Emma, we could go on. I mean, I've personally found that as a gastroenterologist, one of the most exciting aspects of your wisdom and your work. But
yeah, it all started with the gut and the eating of fruit, and that everything else came from there. So that's where it fits in very nicely.
Yeah, sort of. It's you know, it's kind of similar to what we say in medicine, like this Hippocrates quote, all diseases start in the gut. I mean, people are realizing that a lot of things that we never thought. I mean, I didn't myself when I chose gastroenterology, that would be such an important organ, but clearly it plays a central role in this, in evolution and influencing the brain behavior, things that
aging,
aging.
Yeah.
So let's switch to this. If you put your hat on as a neuroendocrinologist and your longstanding interest in sex hormones. So you said this sentence, I think we're biased by thinking of estrogens as ovarian hormones rather than thinking of them as brain signals. You want to expand on that statement?
Yeah, I mean, in medicine and with humans, there's just a lengthy history that estrogens were formed in the ovaries, and that's where testosterone came from the testes, estrogens came from the ovaries, period, and that has driven all of much clinical research and clinical perspectives and what we educate children or young people to think about in biology. But it's not actually completely accurate certainly from an evolutionary perspective, but also from a functional perspective. And I mean, I just like to point out that when vertebrates first evolved and estrogens, there was estrogens being produced by the ovaries, but the largest group of vertebrate animals on the planet are the teleost fishes, and so all the fishes you think about, tuna, bass, minnows, I mean, they're all teleost fishes, and there's trillions of them on the planet, and those fish have aromatase, the enzyme that makes estrogen, in their brains, and it's expressed at, I mean, not all of them have been studied, but the few that have been studied, they have it in their brains at 1,000-fold greater concentrations than is the amount of aromatase in the ovaries. So the brain, for 300 or plus million years, has been making lots of estrogen. So that's one way of thinking about it. But another way of thinking about it is we tend to think of estrogens as being involved in just reproduction, and we often think about it as being involved in just female reproduction. Well, first of all, in many species, estrogens are extremely important for male reproductive processes. What motivates males to be reproductive can often be in mice, it's estrogens that motivate the males. It's estrogens that stimulate aggressive behaviors. But estrogens can also be involved in many things that have nothing to do with reproduction. They can be involved in hippocampal function and memory capabilities. We know that in some birds and probably also in humans that estrogens are involved in auditory processing. Some of your audience may have seen speakers before where they talk about, well, estrogens act through these receptors, the alpha, estrogen receptor alpha or estrogen receptor beta. And these molecules, these receptors tend to act by regulating sort of transcriptional processes in cells, big, massive changes in cell function and structure and stuff. But there are also in the brain estrogen receptors on membranes. And that can, if they're activated, they can rapidly regulate the excitability of individual neurons. And so, and we know that work that we've done and been confirmed in other species that estrogens are formed at the synapse. And if there's a postsynaptic membrane receptor, you have something exactly like what you have for any neurotransmitter system or neuromodulatory system. So this idea that I think we need to start thinking about estrogens as being a brain signal as much as it is an ovarian signal. And yes, across the menstrual cycle, estrogens change in women, but you know what? So does testosterone. And because in order to make estradiol, the female hormone, you have to have testosterone. Estradiol is derived directly from testosterone by this enzyme aromatase. So the female ovary makes testosterone, but converts it to estradiol locally. But testosterone can also reach the circulation where it can go everywhere in the body. And if you have aromatase somewhere else, you can make estrogen there. And that's what happens in the brain. So, I can go on and on about this forever, but just one last point is that, I talked about fish and having a lot of aromatase, and in at least some of the fish, all that aromatase is in these glial cells, and not in neurons per se, but it can be in both in different species. Well, we also now know that if you have a brain injury, and this is studies that's been done in mice and in other species, estrogens can promote recovery of neural trauma and can do so very potently. And one thing that we know happens in birds is that, it happens in mammals too, is that these glial cells called astrocytes, when there's an injury, they can become what's called reactive. One of the things they do is they upregulate aromatase, so they can make estrogen. In birds, if you block their ability to make estrogen, just in those astrocytes around the injury site, you get a much bigger injury. So the brain, the astrocytes, they may be making testosterone, but they're certainly making estrogens that are neuroprotective. Fish, as you know, start out small and they get big and big and big and big all throughout their lives. And in order to do that, there is a tremendous amount of plasticity in their central nervous system to grow certain ways as the fish grows. Think about a tuna that has an eye this big. Well, it started out with a retina this big. So, it's the retina is a part of the brain. It's grown. So we think that estrogens have had a long history in promoting plasticity and growth in the brain, and we need to get back to thinking about that and not just thinking about it as an ovarian hormone.
So this makes me think about, one question first, is, like a very simplistic question, is, do estrogens have in general an inhibitory effect on, like, for example, on the stress system, or in the emotional arousal system, or or you can't say that. It depends on the region of the brain, or
I think it depends on the region of the brain and other collective, neuromodulators or signals, including other steroids.
Mhm. The other question was a topic. So this topic of estrogen replacement therapy. So that was all. So there was a big enthusiasm about this many years ago, and it was stopped. These trials were stopped because of side effects. So you would almost have to think about that a testosterone replacement therapy might be, better or more effective, or even somehow interventions that stimulate aromatase in these glial cells.
I completely agree with you. I mean, again, I'm, one of the issues that I find a bit troubling is that, as a scientist who doesn't study mice and who doesn't study humans, we've learned a lot about these things, and it doesn't necessarily transfer over to the clinical side. And but yes, if you think you're going to, if you want to get estrogens into the brain to maintain sort of cognitive processes in females postmenopausally, if you're worried about giving estrogens peripherally because they might stimulate a mammary, tumor or uterine tumor, then you can avoid that potentially by giving testosterone, which will only be converted to estrogen in places where there is a significant amount of aromatase. Now, mammary tissues do have some aromatase, and so it may not be a perfect replacement, but if you could design a testosterone molecule that could only be activated upon crossing the blood-brain barrier, then be liberated, then it would be available for the aromatases in the brain. Or you could find drugs that might just directly upregulate aromatase in the brain. Females have testosterone in their blood, and they do all throughout the menstrual cycle. I mean, all throughout their life, and especially across the menstrual cycle. And we know that testosterone reaches the brain because we know that it can affect libido and other behaviors in females. So I think there's room for thinking about this that I don't think anybody's thinking about it, because nobody's going to make any money off of giving testosterone to females, because it's just not a pharmacologically economically productive approach.
Yeah, which is which is always a sad thing, that some things that might actually have. I think I talked about this same topic with another podcast invitee, that some of the things that we start to realize are not lucrative enough for the pharmaceutical industry to get involved, and
Right.
This seems to be another.
Yeah.
area. But it's also fascinating to me to talk to someone like you, who's one of the most preeminent bird specialists, to talk about something that's really close to the clinic and to female health and longevity, which I'm not sure if I have heard this conversation or something similar to that a lot. It's so we've been funded by the NIH on these studying sex differences in brain-gut interactions. But the role of testosterone has not really come up as sort of a major, and aromatase as a major topic of all the centers that are participating and are being funded, which is interesting,
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've touched on the points that I was particularly interested in. I don't know if you want to mention something from your research, what you're particularly at this stage of your career, what is sort of the most important, the most intriguing question that you're pursuing at the moment?
Again, I'm with the mannequins, I'm quite interested in trying to elucidate the neural pathway from the brain out to the muscles. We've started those kinds of studies, and it's some of these studies they move along quite slowly because we're working in the rainforest, and we're using catching wild birds, and we don't want to use too many birds because we don't want to upset the population, and so we have to be very, very careful. So things move relatively slowly. And you know, we've taken electrophysiological equipment down to Panama, and you know, it works for the first day, but the humidity is 90%, and you know, things just start falling apart. So it's hard to do. You know, some of my interest is in it's less involved in the research and more involved in some of the things I've been talking about is, you know, like I said, I've been funded by National Institute of Health, and we learned a great deal about brain aromatase and all these things. And yet it hasn't reached the clinical realm. And it's just mind-boggling to me. I mean, when I lecture to my students, I show them a picture of here's a mouse brain that has been where you've induced a stroke by putting a thread into the brain and cut off a blood supply, and here's the size of the you know, the damage in the brain. And here's another animal where you did the exact same thing, but you treated that animal with estradiol, and you know, the damage is only this big. I mean, it's unbelievable. And of course, you would look at that and you'd say, by God, I want to take estradiol. If I get bopped in the head, I want to take estradiol. And of course, I'm saying that jokingly, but it's a profound impact. And yet, you know, it's
I mean, it's not part of the guidelines. It's not part of the treatment. The guidelines for stroke, as far as I'm aware of, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it is part of the guidelines, and it's amazing to me. And you know, when we know so many women are struggling with Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementias or neurodegenerative problems, and yet, and yes, we know there's this correlation with menopause and the loss of estrogens. But of course, again, one of the problems with the Women's Health Initiative, that study, was that when they were looking at hormone replacement therapy, you know, some women continued hormones immediately when menopause happened. Some women waited several years. Well, and they were all sort of lumped together, and we know that in the mice, if you wait too long, you lose the ability of the estrogens to have their neuroprotective actions. So they're just, you know, a devoted focus on these animals in these contexts with an open mind about using estrogens, forgetting the finances, but thinking about it from a health perspective. Again, the finances, the costs of cognitive loss in humans is enormous, and it's just going to get worse and worse and worse as our population gets older and older and older. And if there was a very cost-effective way of minimizing that, you would think the insurance companies would be crazy for it. But I don't know how to change the political and financial, you know, pharmaceutical healthcare business.
Yeah, I mean, there's some very strange situations like that that are very hard to understand for, you know, for a scientist or somebody that knows there would be answers, but they're not happening because it's either not a priority. I mean, this whole, you know, the effort of the NIH to fund, you know, studies for sex as an important variable is sort of at the center. I mean, that is helping because it was not the case until a few years ago, or I would say 10 years ago. And I still remember when that started. I mean, there was Art Arnold at UCLA invited me to this workshop. This was preceding the ORWH. So this is a relatively new science, a new focus, but it's not. I don't think it is. It is strong enough at this point to really bring all these insights. I mean, when I think about, it's still sort of amazing to me that somebody who has been studying songbirds all his life would say these things. It would come up with these conclusions and identify the shortcomings of a very practical clinical problem that we have and
Yeah. I mean, I pointed out earlier about that we know that in the songbirds that auditory processing is influenced by estrogens, and yet we know also that hearing loss is something that it increases in women postmenopausally. So there's a hormone effect either on the cochlea, on the peripheral ear, or in the processing of acoustical information, and we know that from studies in birds, and I mean, and we can study it, but is it being considered with respect to humans? And I bet it isn't. So it's a shame.
Yeah, it's certainly, one of my goals at this stage in my career to spread these kind of messages as far as possible across disciplines. I mean, because if you stay within the discipline, it's unlikely to sort of cross-fertilize. You have to sort of take this out to people who have not thought about it before and say, wow, this is something, I want to invest money in it, or,
Yeah. Well, I'm if anything comes up and I can help, and if your audience members appreciate this, and if any of them have any, could be of help, I think it's wonderful. I'm happy to try to put my 2 cents in.
Okay, great. Well, I'd like to thank you for this fascinating interview. It was really, um, yeah, when we first talked about this, I didn't know all these implications and all these, in which areas this sort of the discussion goes into. And then this was, I hope that the audience finds this equally exciting and fascinating. And yeah, and hopefully we'll be able to play some role maybe together, to promote this message to as many places as possible. I mean, I can think about a few things. If our center gets refunded, to have an event, interdisciplinary conversation on the internet, like a webinar or something like that, where people could listen to that.
Yeah, I'm happy to participate if that would help.
Okay, thanks, Barney.
Okay.
Have a
Well,
nice
thanks
day.
for having me. Appreciate
Okay,
it.
bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.